Are we live now? Oh, we are live now. So, hello and welcome to our Sunday live chat. Something we do every third Sunday at this time, every single month. So, today we're going to be discussing something that baffles a lot of people, and that is the whole concept of focal point. And then I'm asking the question, is focal point really necessary, or is emphasis enough? And so that may open up something to you that you haven't really thought about before. What does emphasis mean? How do you do emphasis? Is focal point just another way of emphasizing? So you'll be the ones to ask the questions, and I'll be the one to give the answers. I might say this for those of you who are watching or just happen to catch us, and you're not yet a member. We call ourselves Studio Insiders. Anybody can watch what we're doing today, but only members can ask questions. It's part of the perks of your joining and paying a little fee. I think it's $4.99 a month, and pardon me. In order to become a member, all you have to do is hit the word join when you're watching any of our video quick tips or any of our YouTube videos. So let's see who's coming on. We're seeing some folks. Krister, good evening. Cheryl, Joni, Renee, hello. Everybody seems to be in a good mood there, at least sounding like it. So, from Sweden, Krister from Sweden, welcome. What time is it in Sweden, Krister? Krister? Sorry about that. It's got to be either very, very early in the morning or late in the evening. He said, she. Good evening. I got to be careful about my pronouns here. Okay. So, to get started, I want to give you just a little bit of an overview of what we mean, and then I'm going to show you a little video to kind of get your gray matter stirred up a bit. So, by focal point, we mean that you do something within your painting that calls the attention to that something when a viewer first looks at it. It's something we do to draw the viewer into the painting. But people also use the term center of interest, which is even, I think, better than the term focal point because it suggests a larger area. So the question is, well, okay, and then there's what I'm addressing overall, and that is emphasis. How do you place emphasis in your painting? Are you just copying a photograph when you're painting, or when you go out in plein air, are you simply just copying what's in front of you? Or are you finding ways to emphasize some things and de-emphasize others so that you can have a little bit of say over how the viewer enters into your painting and how the viewer looks at it? That dubbing is way off. What does that mean, Roger? Mary Ellen says, just wanted to let you know that the dubbing is way off. Does that mean that is my voice way behind the video? Is that what you mean, Mary Ellen? The dubbing way off? Have we got that problem again? Okay, yeah, I assume everybody can hear okay. Is that a problem? Everybody can hear fine, but the audio is trailing behind the video. Is that right? I'm saying it and then you're hearing it, right? So we're making a point right now to see if we can sort that out. Roger is at the board trying to sort that out. So in the meantime, be thinking of questions that you have about the whole issue of focal point. Does it bug you about the need for a focal point? Does that bug you? Or is it not an issue for you? Or have you ever given thought that the focal point by itself might not be enough? So, I can't really see the chat right now, so I don't know what folks are saying. There we go. Okay, Marilyn says yes, that's right. Joni says yes, that's right. Okay, everybody's saying yes. We can hear the audio, but it's not in sync. Well, maybe you just want to close your eyes and listen. Not too bad, still functioning, Laura says. Can hear you, small delay. All right, I apologize for that, but I was hoping that that might get straightened out by this time, because we had that problem last time too.
No, time before. Last time was good.
Well, last time was good. We had time. Well, okay, that problem has happened before. So I'm going to blame it on the software we're using, and just try to tolerate it if you can. Hang in there with us. All right, so at this point, what I would like to do, video is behind your audio. And yes, I have been trouble deciding on focal point. All right, I think maybe it's a good time to show you the little intro video I have for you, and see if it doesn't stimulate some questions. And while you're watching the video, hopefully it's in sync. While you're watching the video, if questions come to mind, go ahead and type them in chat so that we can see them, and I can. Okay, having trouble figuring out what a good focal point would be when composing. How do you decide? All right, well, let me address that on the other side of the video, but let's hang on to that question as the one to start out with. So, are we ready for the video, Roger? Can we show that now?
Not quick clicking in the wrong places.
What was that?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's the video, and we'll see you on the other side.
Is the focal point necessary in order to have a successful painting, or is emphasis enough? We think of a focal point as being some area in a painting to which the eye goes first. But what if we change that label and use instead the word emphasis? There is a difference. Focal point implies a small area around which everything else centers. But the word emphasis is actually one of the composing principles we work with, and it suggests just what it says, the degree to which something is emphasized. Let's look at a few of our artists in history and see exactly what they were doing with this concept. In order to use emphasis, there's one thing that we always have to keep in mind, and that is the primary fundamental of emphasis is that we cannot emphasize in any area without de-emphasizing elsewhere. Very simple, but must happen. In Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World, there's no doubt that Christina is the focal point. Look what he's done there. Her dark hair against very, very light, bright light on the top of her dress, or on the shoulder part of her dress, within this dark middle value surrounding. So our eyes go there first, but if we change that concept of focal point to emphasis, then we have something else. We have the strongest emphasis here, we have a secondary emphasis here, and we have a tertiary emphasis here. Now look what happens if we take all that away, or take the primary, secondary and tertiary emphasis away. We have just Christina, and it seems relatively empty. So instead of thinking of just a single focal point, we can think of it in terms of emphasis, not quite so much emphasis, and still not quite so much emphasis as that. Now look at what else he's done. He's de-emphasized the field. We would think of a field like that as having maybe very tall grasses, lots and lots of texture, and maybe even a little more value contrast when you consider the strong light here against her hair. But you see, he's taken that texture away and giving us a de-emphasis, which puts more emphasis here. So yes, we could call that a focal point, but if we change that to emphasis, don't we get a little broader meaning? In Boudreau's The Little Knitter, we see him creating a focal point very much like Andrew Wyeth created the focal point. And that is with the strong light surrounding a strong dark. Looking at it analytically, we can see that the lightest, or the strongest contrast is right here, right in this area, where the very, very bright area surrounds a very, very dark area. And we see it picked up right here, the very, very light area picked up right here with the little girl's, top of the little girl's dress. But let's look at what else he's done there. If we are thinking of that just as a focal point, or you might say the girl is the focal point. But I think he meant for you to go to her face first, and here's why. If you look at how he's handled her feet, you can see clearly that the value contrast of her feet against the shadow area or the darker area, you might say, around her feet, is a much closer value contrast than he's put here around her head. And if you look at it even more carefully, you'll see that he's de-emphasized in other ways. The other elements in the painting are a closer value contrast. Look at this foliage against this area and how very, very close the value contrast here is the top. A little stronger down here, but how very close the value contrast is here with this little piece of foliage. Just barely a little contrast there. And over in this area, how close the value contrast is. And we could even see that in the bottom portion of her garment, the value contrast is closer than it is here as it gets closer to her face. So if we change the concept from focal point to emphasis, we can see that Boudreau has used different degrees of emphasis here to give us a complete painting where every element counts, but every element is subdued to the little girl's face. One important one is right here. Notice how the isolation of the darker flower in the light area here it causes us to go there after we've gone here. But notice that he has not used a very brilliant saturated color in that flower. He's used a subdued and dark color of red. And so that, even though it's isolated, the emphasis, the image being very much smaller and the color being very much subdued, then causes us to go there as a secondary emphasis. So now if we look at the painting as a whole, and if we think in terms of emphasis rather than focal point, we can use the word focal point as the primary emphasis. But then if we are concerned with emphasis throughout the painting, we'll see that every single thing he's done here is to emphasize the girl's face and de-emphasize everywhere else. John Singer Sargent is an artist that has continued to fascinate all artists since, and especially artists today are intrigued by him. Looking at this painting called Kashmir, what would you call the focal point? Would you call it the isolated girl in the center here? Or would you call it the two figures looking out and facing us? Or would you call it something else? But if you change that concept from focal point to emphasis, we see that he's done several things here to create an emphasis. So perhaps the idea is not about the focal point, but perhaps the idea is about the movement of the girls or the women. Or perhaps it has something to do with what's going on within their culture. Notice the things that he's actually done to make us, to call our attention. And that's what we do with emphasis. We call attention. So look at what he's done. Of course, these two figures looking straight at us call our attention to them. This figure isolated, the very light with the dark surrounding her, surrounding her garment. The isolation sets her aside from this figure, whose garment also is very light in the dark environment, but the fact that this is isolated causes our eye to go there before, perhaps, we go here. But look at something else. What about this figure right over here? This figure, if you'll notice, let's go back to the language of the visual language, the value contrast, you'll notice here, as this figure, even though the figure's going off the edge, which causes it to pull a lot of weight, a lot of attention, the value contrast within this figure is much less than it is in this figure or even in this figure. And notice something else he's done. The edges, crisp edges along the garment here of this figure, a very empty space here, de-emphasized, doesn't define what's back there, just gives us this kind of middle dark value. This figure looking down, the edge is emphasized here, but then look at the bottom, how he's de-emphasized the edges here, having lost edges going right in from the outside here to the inside of this garment, going a little lost edge right here. And then as you allow your eye to scan around, you'll find other places where we have that feeling of lost edge, a same value of one color moving into the same value of another. But the de-emphasis is the surroundings. Very little described in the surroundings, a whole lot described within the women themselves. So that's just a little survey to get you thinking about the concept of focal point versus the concept of emphasis. So now it's time for your questions.
The first question I saw was the question of not knowing. Okay, good. Not knowing how to choose a focal point. It's not so important that you choose a focal point as it is that you are focused on what you are interested in. Why did you choose this scene to begin with? And the overall, well, let's say all that you choose to put into your painting in order to emphasize in one way or another, in order to emphasize the thing that caught your attention. Now, when we say focal point, we mean that area that the eye will probably go to first. Now, one thing is really obvious for the focal point, and that is when you have converging lines. Like if you were looking down a street, you're looking down a street, say in a little town, and there are buildings on either side. The street itself is going to converge, and that's going to pull the eye towards those converging lines. Going to pull the eyes towards them. By the fact that lines move together and converge, they pull our eye to them. That's kind of an automatic focal point. So if you're choosing something where you have things moving in the distance by converging lines, you have an automatic focal point. Anytime you have a contrast of any kind, so if you're looking at something, for example, that is a shape that's different from other shapes, say if you're looking in a pasture, say you've got a herd of cattle that you're looking at. If one of the cows is black and the rest of them are red-orange, the black one is going to get the attention. Likewise, if you're looking at out in a pasture and there's a single animal out there, that animal itself, by virtue of what it is different from its surroundings. that's going to automatically be a focal point. So you see, one way that you get those are some ways you get focal points is by the image, an image being different from other things around it, surrounding it. And also that image, it will be in isolation. So the fact of isolation automatically builds in a focal point. The other things that build in focal points, if you remember the Sargent piece, the two women looking at us, if you're working with people and some people are looking out at the viewer, that's going to pull the viewer into. We're going to look at someone who's looking at us. There's a psychology there. So that's going to be an automatic focal point. So what is it that gets your attention? That's my point. Little play on words there. That's my point. What is it that gets your attention? And then the next question is, then how do you treat all the other images so that the attention goes there, but other images remain important, but not overly important? So I hope I answered that question. Now, Linda says, can you use a paintbrush stroke texture to emphasis? Yes. If you have a really heavy texture, impasto texture, with a smoother texture somehow surrounding it, that's a difference in texture that will help pull the focal point. Now, the paintbrush stroke by itself might not, unless within it has a value of contrast. If the strokes have, if by nature of the strokes side by side, one stroke is more contrasted than another, that would pull the eye to it. So it has to be something that's different that will call the eye to it. Mary Ellen says, how does one determine a focal point in non-objective painting? Well, again, it's determining the focal point, where the focal point is going to be. We don't want to make rules of that, but there are some guidelines that you can use. And the guidelines are useful in non-objective painting as they are in realistic painting. Now I'm going to show you a little something here. I'm going to draw, you can't see me doing it, but I'll show it to you after I do. Draw just a rectangle and show you something. All right, now, you can see this. From corner to corner of every rectangle, in the center, between the corners and the center, are areas where the eye feels good going. Now, that is based on the principle of the golden mean. But it's sort of a proven method of placing a focal point so that the eye feels good going there. It's not the only method, and it doesn't have to be a tiny point. It can be a larger area. Another thing that you could do, if your non-objective painting has lots of rhythm in it, you can align, and let me show you again, you can align the movement, I'm going to show you several things. For one thing, you can align the movement along that movement that goes from corner to corner on either side. Now, you could see that Wyeth sort of does that with Christina. Oops, I had a little mental slip there. Wyeth does that with Christina's, the way he has Christina's body arranged. If you look at the painting, you'll see that the body is actually arranged so that it is aligned with the two corners, the corner on opposite ends of that alignment. Now, there's a secondary way that you can align, and that is to parallel. So you could place some of your main contrast, lines of contrast, or movements or rhythms of contrast, you could place in parallel with these lines, and that also is a good place. The eye feels good going there. Wherever the eye feels good going first is a good focal point. Now, if you have, if you're doing the kind of non-objective painting where you might have, your emphasis might be pretty clear, pretty even throughout. Thinking of Jackson Pollock, for example, then making those stronger areas or the stronger lines, or even maybe making movements that cross over each other in the areas of the eyes of the rectangle would be a good way to pull a, how can we say it, an aesthetically pleasing area where the eye feels good going. Now, that's just a guideline. It's by no means a rule, but it's just a little guideline that you can follow. Other thing that you might check into is the armatures of dynamic symmetry. Now, I won't go into that because that gets really mathematical, but it starts out with the same sort of thing I'm doing here, but then there are ways that you can divide space according to dynamic symmetry, the principle of dynamic symmetry, and allow your whatever you're using. Are you using a repetition of color? Are you using the rhythm? Are you using contrasting shapes? Those sorts of things. Whatever you're using as your main focus. There we go again. In your non-objective painting. So maybe that would at least get you started in thinking about that. Now let's see. Lynn says, in painting with the ladies, there seem to be a few different emphasized areas. I do not understand why you would want more than one area of emphasis. They seem to compete a bit to me. Now remember, this is Sargent who's doing that, and Sargent was the master. They are very subtly emphasized. Now, focal point is very misleading. The fact, if you're told you must always have a focal point, that's misleading. If you look back in history to the masters who remain, who we still study today, trying to figure exactly what they were doing, you'll see that that's not necessarily true. I'm thinking about the School of Athens by Raphael, where you do have those center figures of Plato and Aristotle. And it's very obvious that they are the central figure, but you have other important things going on in there too. You have groupings of people that are having conversations or doing important things. So there's a very subtle, and we don't really know if Sargent, well, I think Sargent was sort of playing with us just a little bit, but it's a very well balanced piece. And what you will notice is that, pardon me, the frogs always get in my throat when I'm having these chats for some reason. It's always a competition with frogs. Hang in there with me. What I was saying about the Sargent piece, he was you'll notice because of the way he handled the value contrast of the figures against the ground, the figures against each other, because of the way he grouped the figures, and also because of the way he used edges, if you examine that very carefully, you'll see that the whole painting is important. And we don't mind stopping with one and then visiting another. So, what was the question? I do have a way of going on, and then I forget what I was saying. I forget what it was about. Why you want one more area? The whole thing is the emphasis. When the idea is the emphasis, not just the image itself, but when the idea is the emphasis, then there might be several things within the composition that is expressing the idea. So that when your eye, when it's not all confused or not all too boring, but when there are things that are emphasized, then it's sort of like a good piece of music, where you don't necessarily just hear one tune, but you might also hear what's going on in the background or that sort of thing. Okay, perhaps I gave that one a good ride. Can you overemphasize an area? If so, how do you know? You can overemphasize, not necessarily a single area, but you can overemphasize throughout a painting. Now, for example, go back to the Boudreau. Can you remember, just in your minds, you remember the Boudreau? If a little girl were sitting on a stone seat, like that little girl is in Boudreau's painting, chances are, and you were looking at her, chances are you might see the head, her face against the background, and her feet about in the same or similar kind of light. Now, if you took of course let's assume it's today, we're making this up as we go. If you took a picture of that, the camera might show an equal part of light on the feet as the camera shows in the girl's face. The camera might also show a whole lot more detail in that rose in the background if it were actually there. And it might show more detail or more value contrast within the foliage that was around it. But by de-emphasize, when we de-emphasize, here's what we do. We do the opposite of emphasis. If it's value contrast, strong value contrast, it's going to bring our eye to it. When we don't have to reduce it much, but if we slightly reduce the value contrast, we begin to de-emphasize. And then when we de-emphasize by using a very slighter, a closer value contrast in one area, then the area where the stronger value contrast is going to be emphasized. So if we overemphasize areas throughout, giving the same value contrast to the areas throughout, it's confusing because the eye really doesn't know where to go. And so you look at the best painting or the most successful paintings in our history, you'll see that the artist is giving emphasis to certain areas, either with a stronger contrast or more vibrant color, or there are a number of ways to do it. But then in other areas, there are to a degree de-emphasized. So I don't know. I suppose you could overemphasize the focal point, but not if you balance the emphasis everywhere else. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I would worry more about overemphasizing areas other than the focal area, the area of interest. I would be concerned more about giving too much emphasis in other places than I would be giving too much emphasis there. I hope I'm right with that. You may quote me if it works, and if it don't, I wouldn't quote me. Cheryl, using tools of emphasis, how do we emphasize a secondary and tertiary image, yet not give too much emphasis that distracts from the primary image, as in wife? Good question. One way, look how Wyeth did it. Wyeth de-emphasized with size. Of course, that automatically happens when you place something in the distance. But one way he de-emphasized was with size. The house Christina is moving towards is a little bit larger than the little outbuilding that's right above her head. But if you look at it more closely, another way he de-emphasized, if you look within that house, the values are not as contrasty within the house as they are within Christina. The values are strongly contrasted. Her hair against the shoulder with the light shining so bright, that is very, very strong value contrast. If you look within the image of the house itself, you'll see that the values are much less contrasted. Even though the house is darker against the light of the sky, still the contrast on the inside of the image itself is very, very close. And then if you look at the smaller building, you'll see it's even less contrasted. And you might say there's not as much detail there. One way that you get strong detail is by using strong value contrast in creating your detail. And so if you want to put lots of detail in, but you don't want to call attention to it, you decrease the value of contrast. So, whatever methods we use to de-emphasize, value contrast is one of the most, I guess you say, the strongest tool we have. Also, decreasing the saturation of the color. There's not a lot of saturation in Wyeth's work, but in some works, you may see this especially in Richard Schmid's work. He uses a lot of saturated color, but you'll notice that areas where he wants to, as secondary areas of interest or areas of emphasis and tertiary areas of emphasis, there won't be the saturation. The color won't have the saturation that it has in the primary area of emphasis. And in the tertiary areas of emphasis, you'll see less saturation of color. You'll also see less value contrast. So that's one way. It's not the only, but that is one of the major ways that we do that, one of the major tools we use to do that. Oh, we got bunches of them there. Oh, that's many thanks. Okay, you're welcome, Mary Ellen. You're welcome, Lynn. You're welcome, Laura. You're welcome, Bridget. Okay, are we out of questions? Sure, we're not out of questions. Yeah. Other questions? Let me. I can kind of go through the tools we use. You know, we don't think of composing. I mean, you could say the principles of composition. It's so dull. And it sounds like that you have a goal you have to aim for. But that is totally a misinterpretation. What we call principles of composition are actually tools that we use to control our paintings, to control what goes on in our paintings. They're tools. And that's the reason I like to call them composing tools, or composing, we could call them composing principles if we wanted to. But I'll just go through while you're thinking of other questions, if you are thinking of other questions. I'll kind of go down a list with you. The major one for emphasis and focal point, if you want to continue to use that word. Remember though, let me do a little sidebar here. Focal point as a thing that we use is a way of emphasizing. It's just a strong way of emphasizing. So emphasis is itself a composing principle. When you say emphasis, you also are including de-emphasis. It's the full continuum, or from the strongest emphasis you can give something to the weakest emphasis you get it. Now, the tools that we can use there, the major tools that we can use, one, as I said before, just to kind of summary for you, is value contrast. Contrast itself, but value contrast is one of the major kinds of contrast that we can use. It's one of the major kinds. It's the major thing we use in composing, in our composing structure. Value is caused by how the light is hitting and how things are falling into shadow, and so it is one of the major. But then other kinds, the saturation of color. Saturation of color is highly important in creating emphasis. The degree to which the color is saturated, especially when it's surrounded by colors that are less saturated to neutral of each hue, of whatever hue you're using, that's another way of creating emphasis. And the kinds of contrast, the contrast of different kinds of shape, where you might have a round shape within square shapes. So, I went through that a little bit earlier. So any kind of contrast of texture. Well, you can go through the visual language. And the visual language, anything that can be contrasted. Value, all those elements of color that can be contrasted. Shape, that can be contrasted. Size, small against large, that can be contrasted. Direction, how the movement of one area against the movement of the other, that can be contrasted. So you could just go through the list of the visual elements, and all of those can be contrasted, and they also can be made similar. And the more similar they are, the less emphasis they contain. Then another way of emphasis, of course, is the isolation, where you have something that's isolated, like in the Sargent piece. The one girl there in the center that's separated from the group, she's in isolation. Christina is in isolation. And the buildings are all in isolation too. The directional movement, and of course that has to do with the converging lines I talked about at the very beginning. But a movement that's going in one way contrasted with a visual movement that's going in another. The edges, the harder, crisper edges get more emphasis. The softer edges have less emphasis. The lost edges, you don't have any emphasis at all. Your eye just goes right through it. The way an individual, or you say something that's living, or you say anything that it feels like it's facing something. Whatever direction it's facing, that gives an emphasis. And if it's facing you, if a person is facing you, that gives emphasis. And repetition. Repetition is another one. This is another one I did not mention. In the Sargent piece, those figures, it's the repeated female figure, all of them are clothed very similar. That is repetition. That is emphasis. It's emphasis of a topic. Also, emphasis is creating a movement. So that's just kind of a summary, which I might have taken a little too deep, but that's just kind of a summary of the kinds of things that can give emphasis, and the tools. They're tools that you can use. They're tools without rules. All right, Bridget, what are your thoughts on Rothko's paintings where there doesn't seem to be any emphasis at all? The emphasis that Rothko is of a non-objective school that was trying to get things down to the most simplified. And a lot of times you see that all the edges are soft. No, but you'll notice that the way he places the shapes, the way the shapes are placed on the canvas is where it goes. He doesn't tend to give strong emphasis, but he does have subtle emphasis. You'll know there will be subtle contrast of colors sometimes. You can't make rules about that because he was dealing with abstraction, and it was. I don't have an opinion. You said, what are your thoughts about Rothko? Yes. Rothko was of that school of thought, of that school of abstraction that was minimalism, moving towards minimalism, where they weren't interested in the image or how the image communicated so much as they were a statement made of the visual language that was, what is the very barest necessity? What do you need? Just paring things down to the very least necessary, or needed, I should say, least needed. So it's just another concept, another philosophy of painting. Okay, Krista, if you have a painting with an automatic focal point, like a road disappearing in the distance, can you use emphasis on objects closer to the viewer so that the distant focal point loses importance? Yes. Very good point. Very good point. Yes, you can. And that is a wonderful way to do it, because a lot of times, when there are lines converging, they are going to pull you to it, and they will be very, very strong. You can de-emphasize their contrast, the lines that are converging as they converge, as they move into distance to converge. But yes, indeed, you can use images closer up with a stronger contrast. What was the emphasis on objects closer to the viewer so that the distant focal point loses importance? That, yes, indeed. That is a wonderful tool to use. So go for it.
Like the picture behind you.
Like the picture behind me. Yes, let me just move over just a bit and let you see the picture behind me, and you'll see exactly. We could do that there with this picture behind me. All right. Okay, other questions? Do I need to get on another, do I need to preach another sermon? Are we going to get some more questions of this? Did everybody go to sleep? No, everybody's still here. Okay, Laura, thank you for providing examples and explaining the variation of the main focus concept. Good, Laura, good. Let's see, Bridget, what do you, okay, Lynn, would you say that, Lynn, would you say that it would be, wait just a minute, Lynn, sometimes I don't read well off a screen. Would you say that it would be would you say that it would create a more pleasing design to have more areas of less emphasis in a line of action, or is it actually okay to have them bouncing around the painting? The important thing is that you don't create chaos. One way that we prevent chaos in our paintings is by controlling the amount of emphasis that we put in there. And so when there's a lot of action going on, a lot of movement going on, I think it's probably a good idea to control the contrast, especially. The value contrast is one thing that you can control. You know, if you can imagine, if you take the same color, this is a good example for you. This is brilliant. If you take the same color, if you have a bucket of paint or whatever, you take the same color and you start throwing it on the canvas, and you have the whole canvas covered in the same color. I mean, everything. You don't have any white canvas showing. You don't have anything because you haven't got any value contrast, or you haven't got any color contrast. So I'm saying, I think the important thing there is to control the value contrast especially, and control the saturation of the color. And then you can have as much activity as you want, and it will feel active. You don't want to subdue it too much. I don't want to suggest that. You know, you'll find it. You know when it feels right. Not just because you just don't decide that you like it just because you did it, but it must feel right. The activity must feel right. Here, sermon, please. Yes, I actually was looking at the picture behind you. Okay, good. Krista, Laura, if you have an example. We've got Mary's art. Or say a nice ornamentation on a building as emphasis. Yes, this building on Krista's questions. Yes, anything. Use your imagination. Go out looking for it. You will absolutely, once our minds open up to possibilities, then we see them. A lot of times we don't see possibilities simply because our minds haven't been open to them yet. So if you go out and start looking for this stuff and start looking at what you can do with it, I think you will be absolutely amazed at the possibilities when you're actually controlling where you put emphasis. If you have any examples of focal point in a still life or a landscape, I don't have anything right here at hand, but I tell you, one of the best, let me be sure I'm going right here. One of the best still life painters current today is, how do you say his name? Chang Wang. I'm not saying it right. It's spelled Qianghang. Google him. He is one of the best still life painters I have, well, in my opinion. He's classically trained. He knows what he's doing. and he knows how to use emphasis. He uses the emphasis of everything I've been talking about. Also, Richard Schmid does wonderful still lifes. Richard Schmid has the ability to do a still life painting that has lots of vibrant color in it, and it still works because of the way he controls the emphasis of other things, and also the way he controls the saturation of the color. I'm sure there are other still life painters too, but those stand out. Every time somebody says still life painting to me, the one that I admire and have been admiring for years is Qiang. I think it's pronounced Chang or Chong Guang. Is that it? But anyway, I'm not good at pronouncing names. Not good at all. Renee. Oh no, Laura, my heart seems to tell me what to emphasize when people or animals are involved. Yeah, your heart's a good one to follow. So, yeah, but don't let it override, don't let it cause you to emphasize too much, because a lot of times things could become therapy if you're not careful. If you really, really love something, and you're doing a painting of it, you still got to, when we reach that point of where you're pulling things into balance, be careful that you don't overemphasize. It could get too syrupy. And I don't mean to be ugly, but yeah, it could get to be too syrupy. Let's see, did I answer the still life question or was there something else that was included in that? Wait a minute. Okay, Renee, my questions have been answered so far. Can't think of any other questions. All right. Linda, will you touch on editing photos to emphasize moving noise? Yes, right. One of the worst mistakes that we as artists can make is to think that we have to paint everything. If we're working from photos, some artists think, some people think that you have to paint everything that's in there. You got to be true to the photo. No. The photo should be used as a reference. You only use find what's necessary in the photo. Find what's necessary. Start with the thing that called your attention to it. And you could start by just doing little thumbnail drawings of the thing that pulled your attention to it, and then start adding stuff. What do you need? It's best to understate, best to not quite say it all completely. Best to understate than to overstate. So advice, I guess, that I would give there is don't be a slave to it. Number one, don't let it boss you. You decide. And the next thing is only use what is necessary in there. Only use what is necessary to get across the idea that you're trying to express in your painting. That may have sounded a little bit too general, but it's hard to give a specific advice unless we're looking at a specific photo. But generally, noise is anything that doesn't belong. Mary's art. I'm seeing it. Thank you, Diane. There is this street in Amsterdam with converging lines that have some beautiful buildings. The end of the street is not interesting. Now I know where to start. Bingo! Wonderful. Go to work, Mary. Okay. Yeah. No. Bridget, not that one. It's the other Chinese artist who is his name is spelled Qiang. Huang, and I don't know how to pronounce either one of them, but is it Chung Ho? Is that his name? He's also a wonderful artist. He also is totally different from the other one. I really need to have to say these names if I'm going to say it right here in front of God and everybody, don't y'all think? But that's just the way it is at the moment.
I know what Claire's trying to say.
Claire. I'm a beggar keeps
And it keeps.
wanting mentor taking acrylic classes instructor. Yeah, I don't know what that means, Claire.
We keep up with the classes.
Oh, keeping up with the classes. Pardon me. Okay, Lynn says, unlike what you said about don't let the photo boss you around. Okay, I can give off the good advice, can't I? I'm pretty good at following my own advice most of the time, except when it comes to some things that, can get you in other kinds of trouble. Okay, we're getting close to the countdown here. Okay, one last chance for questions before we close this out. I do apologize for the sound. I hope it cleared up towards the end. I don't know whether it did not, but thank you all for hanging in there with me. Okay, Claire, second try. I'm a beginner in acrylic painting. Instructor keeps telling me to go darker with my colors. Light colors are timid. Is this a factor of focus? Mary's, okay, wait a minute, okay,
Yeah.
yes. Look, without dark, without your values dark enough, you're not going to have any structure. It's not just a matter of timid, it's a matter of the whole thing being unemphasized. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You've got a full value range from the darkest dark to the lightest light. Last time I counted, there are at least 10 possibilities there of values to use. And so trust yourself. You can do it. You can do it. Yes, Mary's art. That's the one. Chung Hong. Is that right? Qianghang. Yes. Go to his site. Good. Bridget found him. Great. Great. Study his still lifes. Look for emphasis. Look for how he does it. Look at all the things I'm talking about that he manages beautifully.
Linda got the wrong spelling.
Huh?
Linda got the wrong spelling.
Linda, it's Qiang, not Quing. It's Qiang. And Mary's art, cool. Yes, sounds better. Thanks. And all right. Oh, it sounds better. Well, good. All right, kids. Gosh, I'm glad to see that you all stayed with me. So, thanks for all your good questions. You asked questions that made it possible for me to have I think, a fairly decent discussion. So, go out and look for all these wonderful things and apply them to your paintings. I think you're going to find it's a very exciting world out there. If you don't just, well, hey, here's something else. If you don't make yourself a slave to a focal point. That's something else. Don't make yourself a slave to the thing. Look for things that where you can put your emphasis, how you would emphasize, and then how you de-emphasize in order to make the whole thing an area of interest. So I'll sign off for now and say bye-bye, and I'll see you next month on the third Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Wait a minute, Roger's wanting to say something. Did I forget something?
Second Sunday.
Second Sunday? What about it?
Isn't this second Sunday?
Oh, second Sunday. Did I say third? No, this is the third
This
Sunday.
third. Oh,
This
you're
is the
right.
third Sunday. Roger got confused there for a moment. That's okay. We love him anyway.
Okay.
All right. So we'll sign off now. I said that about 3 times already, so I mean it this time. Are you ready to hit the end stream button?